The rain fell soft and silver over downtown Chicago that Friday evening, the kind of rain that did not soak a person all at once but settled slowly into the wool of an old coat. Streetlights bent across wet pavement, and the long line of black sedans crawled up to the entrance of Crane and Vale, the most photographed dining room in the city. Inside, crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over white linen. A soft piano played somewhere near the bar, and waiters in pressed black aprons moved between tables, like dancers who had memorized every step. To anyone walking past, the restaurant looked like a small kingdom of money and good fortune, and that was exactly how its newest manager wanted it to look. A woman in a gray wool coat stepped through the brass door at 20 minutes past 7. She was 72 years old, slight in the shoulders, with silver hair pinned into a low bun and a leather handbag worn smooth at the corners. Her shoes were dark and a little scuffed, the heels rounded by years of walking. She paused just inside the entrance, took a careful breath, and looked around the room the way someone looks at a place they helped build a long time ago. Then she walked, quietly and without fuss, toward the hostess stand. The hostess at the stand was Madison Reed, 25 years old, blonde, lipsticked, a tablet glowing in her hand. Madison had been at Crane and Vale for 9 months, and in those 9 months she had decided that the difference between a good restaurant and a great one was the quality of the people allowed through the door. She looked up, ready to greet the next reservation, and her smile froze halfway across her face. Her eyes traveled down the old woman's coat, the worn buttons, the scuffed shoes, the cracked seam at the corner of the handbag. The smile did not return. In its place came a small, polite mask, the kind people wear when they have already decided how a conversation will end. "Excuse me," the older woman said, her voice steady but soft. "Would you have a table for one, please?" Madison glanced at her tablet without really looking at it. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening, ma'am." The old woman did not argue. She only nodded, half turned toward the door, and at that exact moment, the brass handle opened behind her. A man in a charcoal suit walked in with a woman draped in fur and a handbag the color of caramel. They had no reservation either. They did not even pretend to look at the stand. They simply waited, the way wealthy people wait, as if a table would arrive on its own. Madison's whole face changed. The polite mask dissolved into a real smile, warm and apologetic, with a small forward tilt of the shoulders that said everything was possible for the right kind of guest. "Of course, sir. We just had a beautiful window table open up. Right this way." The older woman watched, and a faint, tired understanding passed across her eyes. She turned back to Madison, gentle, almost apologetic for asking again. "I thought you said you were fully booked." Madison's voice tightened. She lifted her chin just enough for the people at the nearest tables to hear her. "Some of our tables are held for guests who suit the atmosphere of the dining room, ma'am." The piano kept playing, but a small, awful silence settled over the closest tables. A few heads turned. A man laughed under his breath. A woman lifted her wineglass to her lips to hide a smirk. The older woman did not raise her voice. She only asked very politely if she might at least order a bowl of soup. Madison sighed as if she were being asked to do something difficult. "Ma'am, perhaps you should look at our prices first. This isn't a charity kitchen." 3 tables to the left, near the long window that looked out on the rainy street, a man in a clean white shirt sat across from a small girl in a pale blue dress. The man had been studying the menu when the word charity reached him. His shoulders went still. He did not look up right away. He had spent most of his adult life learning when to be quiet, and quiet was, most of the time, the safer answer. But the little girl across from him heard the word too. She heard it the way only a child can hear something cruel, which is to say, without the protective layers grown people use to soften the world. Her hand closed around the small stuffed bear in her lap, and she looked up at her father with eyes that already understood more than she could say. Andrew Blake was 29 years old, 6 feet 3 inches of tired shoulders and quiet patience. He worked as a maintenance technician for commercial cooling systems, which meant he spent most of his days in basements and on rooftops, fixing the things rich rooms depended on without ever being seen by the people sitting at the tables above. His hands were rough at the knuckles and clean at the palms, the hands of a man who washed before he came home to his daughter. His brown hair was cut short, and his jaw still carried the shadow of an early shift, but his eyes were warm and very awake. Andrew had not always lived this way. 3 years earlier, his wife Hannah had died of a long, slow heart condition that no insurance had been built to fully cover. The months at her bedside had emptied his savings and rearranged his life. What had grown back from that emptiness was a quiet, stubborn rule he repeated to his daughter Grace, whenever she asked why their world was smaller than other people's. "People can be without money," he would tell her, "but no one is allowed to be without kindness." Grace was 6. She was a small, watchful child, with pale brown hair tied in a soft blue ribbon, and eyes that took in more than most adults guessed. Her grandmother had died 18 months earlier, and ever since then, Grace had developed a particular tenderness for older women in coats. She did not chatter about it. She simply noticed them, the way some children notice birds. Tonight had been a small, careful celebration. Grace had won her school reading prize, and Andrew had picked up 2 extra weekend shifts to bring her here, to the place she had once seen in the background of a movie, and asked, in that soft voice of hers, whether people like them were allowed inside. He had said yes without hesitation, because he had not wanted her, even once in her life, to believe that any door was closed to her because of what she looked like. When Madison had seated them earlier, she had glanced at Andrew's plain coat and at Grace's small cardigan, and she had walked them past the window seats to a small table near the kitchen door. Andrew had said nothing. He had pulled out Grace's chair and helped her with her napkin and asked her to choose anything she wanted from the menu. He had decided, before they ever opened their menus, that this evening would be hers, not his. But now Grace was not looking at the menu anymore. She was looking at the old woman in the gray coat. And she was looking at her the way she had once looked at her grandmother, which was the worst possible moment for Madison Reed to laugh at a stranger. Crane and Vale had not always been the kind of place where a hostess could speak that way to a customer. The restaurant had been founded 46 years earlier by a young couple with almost nothing in their bank account and a single corner storefront on the south side of the city. Their first dining room had 30 seats, a chalkboard menu, and a handwritten sign in the window that read, in plain black letters, "Every guest deserves a seat with dignity." That sign was still printed across the top of the company's website, in elegant gold serif type. It was on the matchbooks. It was on the back of the menus. It had been there so long that, like a familiar painting, almost no one read it anymore. The young couple who had hung that sign were Henry and Vivian Crane. Henry had died 14 years ago, and Vivian had stepped back from daily operations soon after, leaving the growing company in the hands of their son Daniel. Daniel had built Crane and Vale into a 14-restaurant empire across 3 states. Then he too had passed, suddenly, almost a year ago. The chair he left empty had been filled, after a great deal of board pressure and family argument, by his daughter Scarlett. Scarlett Crane was 28 years old. She had her father's instincts and her grandmother's name, and she had spent the last 11 months trying to prove she deserved both. She wore tailored cream and navy and walked into every room as if she had a meeting on the other side of it. Her hair was a deep chestnut brown, almost the color of polished walnut, and she kept it loose at her shoulders, because her grandmother had once told her that softness was not weakness, it was leverage. She was sharp, careful, and slightly afraid, although she had trained herself never to show the last part. Lately, Scarlett had been receiving a quiet, troubling pile of letters. Old customers, regulars from the early days, writing to say that the restaurants no longer felt the way they used to feel. One letter had come from a retired school teacher who had been asked, very politely, whether she was sure she could afford the entree she had ordered. Another had come from a widower who had been seated next to the kitchen door 3 visits in a row. The local managers always answered the same way. Difficult customers. misunderstandings, slow nights. Scarlett had finally decided she could not solve a problem she had never seen with her own eyes. What Scarlett did not know was that her grandmother had read the same letters. Vivian had read them in her small apartment on the north side of the city, and they had hurt her in a way that surprised her at her age. She had not wanted to believe that the company she had built with Henry, the company whose first sign still hung in a wooden frame in her hallway, could have become a place where an older woman in an old coat would be made to feel small. So Vivian had decided on a rainy Friday evening in May to find out for herself. She had not called ahead. She had not used her name. She had not worn the pearls Henry had given her on their 30th anniversary. She had put on her oldest coat, the gray wool one with the wooden buttons, and she had walked into the flagship dining room of Crane and Vale as the most ordinary woman in the world. Madison did not know any of that. The shift manager, Patrick Sloan, did not know any of that either. Patrick was 42, soft around the middle, with a tie always slightly too tight at the collar. He had been at Crane and Vale for 6 years, and he had learned, in those 6 years, that the safest way to keep his job was to keep the loudest customers happy, and to never, under any circumstance, raise a complaint about a top-performing staff member. The flagship dining room hit its revenue numbers every week, and Madison was one of the reasons. Patrick had heard the whispers about how she treated older or simpler-looking guests. He had heard them, and he had decided, without ever quite saying so to himself, not to hear them. Vivian stood near the hostess stand a few seconds longer than she needed to. She heard the laughter from the nearby table. She heard the man in the charcoal suit say, just loud enough to carry, that places like this should have security at the door. She heard a younger woman whisper to her friend that it was a shame anyone could just walk in off the street. None of it surprised her. All of it broke something small and private in her chest. She gathered herself the way women of her generation had been trained to gather themselves. She tightened her grip on the handbag, squared her shoulders, and prepared to turn for the door. She had her answer. The letters had been true. She would write to Scarlett in the morning, and the two of them would begin the long, painful work of pulling a company back toward what it had once been. But before she could take that first step away, a small voice carried across the dining room. "Daddy," Grace said. "Why does nobody help her?" Andrew did not answer at first. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the bear in her lap. He looked at the silver pin on her cardigan that her grandmother had given her one Christmas. The pin had a small painted sun on it, because his mother had liked to say that kindness was the only weather a person could choose. He thought of his mother, dead now 5 years, who had spent her working life at a hospital laundry, and who had once, when he was 10 years old, been kept waiting 6 hours in an insurance office because she had walked in still wearing her uniform. He could still see her hands that day, red and chapped from the chemicals, folded politely in her lap. He could still see how she had thanked the clerk who had been rude to her, because she did not want her son to learn that anger was the only answer to disrespect. He thought of Hannah, who had asked him, near the end, to promise her one thing: not to be a perfect father, not to be a rich father, only to be a father whose daughter would never have to be ashamed of him when he had to choose between easy and right. "Daddy," Grace said again, and her voice was smaller this time. "If Grandma were here, would they laugh at her too?" Andrew set his napkin down on the table. He did not slam it. He did not push his chair back. He simply folded the cloth into a neat square, the way he folded everything, and he met his daughter's eyes. "You stay right here, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Daddy just needs to do the right thing for a minute." He stood. He was a tall man, and standing made him taller, but he did not use his height as a weapon. He crossed the dining room without hurry, the way a man crosses his own kitchen, and he stopped 2 steps short of the hostess stand. Vivian had just turned for the door. She had a hand half raised to push it open. "Ma'am," Andrew said, gently enough that she would not be startled. Vivian turned. She saw a young man she did not know, in a clean white shirt, with a small girl watching from a table behind him. She lifted her chin slightly, the way a person lifts her chin when she expects to be told something difficult, and she waited. "My daughter and I have an extra chair at our table," Andrew said. "If you would do us the honor of joining us, we would be very glad to have your company." Vivian's lips parted, but no sound came out. Madison Reed turned from the wealthy couple she had been seating and stepped forward, 2 pink spots burning high on her cheeks. "Sir," Madison said, "please return to your table. Guests are not permitted to invite walk-ins to seated parties. We have policies." Andrew did not look at her right away. He kept his eyes on Vivian until the older woman gave a small, almost invisible nod, the kind of nod that meant, "All right, young man, I will not embarrass you by refusing." Only then did he turn to Madison. His voice stayed level. He did not raise it. He did not even sharpen it. "Could you tell me," he said, "which policy allows you to ask an older woman whether she can afford a bowl of soup?" The dining room, which had been pretending not to listen, stopped pretending. The piano kept playing, because the pianist did not know what else to do, but every fork at the closest 6 tables paused above its plate. Madison's mouth opened and closed. She tried for a smile, failed, and tried again for indignation. "Sir, you are making other guests uncomfortable. I'm asking you, politely, to sit down." "I'll sit down," Andrew said. "But the lady is going to sit down with us." He turned, very calmly, to Vivian. He offered his arm, not in any showy way, just the way a man offers an arm to a woman at a wedding, when the walk is long and the floor is uneven. Vivian, after the smallest hesitation, slipped her hand inside the crook of his elbow. They walked together the 18 steps back to his table. Grace was already on her feet, holding her own water glass out in both hands, her small face serious as a church. "You can have mine," Grace said. "Daddy didn't drink his either." Vivian looked at the child, and for the first time that evening her eyes filled with water, and for the first time that evening she let it happen. She lowered herself into the offered chair with the slow care of a woman who had begun to feel her knees, and she took the glass of water from Grace's hands, as if it were the most expensive crystal in the building. The dining room did not know where to look. A woman 2 tables over set her fork down quietly. A man in a striped suit suddenly found something fascinating in the bottom of his soup bowl. The wealthy man in charcoal, whose name was Brandon Pierce, and who had been the first to laugh, cleared his throat and pretended to read a wine list he had already chosen from. Madison did the only thing she knew how to do when she lost control of a room. She walked, fast, to find her manager. Patrick Sloan came out of the kitchen corridor wiping his hands on a clean white towel he did not need. He had been told, in a low, urgent voice, that there was a situation in the dining room and that a guest was disrupting service. He arrived ready to be useful to the loudest person involved, because that was the version of usefulness he had practiced longest. Madison reached him first and gave him a quick, polished version of the story. There was a walk-in without a reservation. There was a man at table 9 making a scene about it. The walk-in was, in her words, not appropriate for the dining room. The guest in question, she added, had refused to return to his table when politely asked. She delivered all of this in the steady tone of a hostess defending her standards, and Patrick nodded along, because nodding was something he was very good at. Patrick crossed the room with the small, careful frown he had been taught at a hospitality seminar in 1997. He stopped beside table 9. He did not look at Vivian. He looked only at Andrew. "Sir," Patrick said, "I'm the manager on shift this evening. I understand you brought a guest to your table who was not invited by the restaurant. I'm afraid I have to ask you to either return our other guest to the entrance for normal seating procedures, or to leave with her." Andrew folded his hands on the table. He spoke quietly, so that Grace would not have to hear adult anger. "Have you spoken to her?" he asked. Patrick blinked. "Excuse me? This woman," Andrew said. "Have you asked her, even once tonight, what she actually wanted?" Vivian spoke for the first time then, very softly. "I asked for a bowl of soup. I told the young lady I would not stay long. I asked her twice." Patrick did not look at Vivian. He looked harder at Andrew. "Sir, the restaurant reserves the right to refuse service to guests who do not match the atmosphere of our establishment. That is standard practice across our industry, and I am sure you understand." Andrew tilted his head. "Does the atmosphere of your establishment have a problem with women over 70, or only with their coats?" 2 tables away, somebody coughed and almost choked. Madison stepped forward, ready with another defense. "Sir, you are publicly insulting a member of staff. We will have to escalate." Andrew turned to her, and although his voice did not rise, something in it had gone very level and very cold, the kind of voice a man uses when he has decided that he no longer cares about the consequences of being correct. "You will not have to escalate," he said. "You will only have to listen. Trouble does not begin when one person speaks up. Trouble begins when a room full of people watches something wrong and nobody says a word." Brandon Pierce, who had not been able to stay quiet, called from his table, "Some of us came here for a peaceful dinner." Andrew did not even turn his head all the way. "And she came here for a bowl of soup in peace." Patrick made a small, anxious gesture toward the front of the restaurant. 2 members of the security staff in dark blazers began, slowly, to drift in from the entrance. Grace, who had been watching with very wide eyes, slipped her small hand into her father's. Vivian looked at the child's hand on the man's hand, and she said, in the careful, gentle voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime keeping the peace, "Young man, please, don't get yourself in trouble for me. I will go. It is all right." Andrew did not let go of his daughter's hand. He kept his eyes on Vivian. "Ma'am," he said, "if my mother were sitting in your chair, would you want a stranger to let her walk out alone tonight?" Vivian's eyes filled again. She did not answer. She did not need to. And it was exactly then, with the security staff 6 paces away and Patrick's hand half raised, that the front door of Crane and Vale opened one more time. 3 people walked in together. The woman in the middle did not look around. She did not ask for a table. She walked straight across the room with a kind of unhurried authority that made the conversations near her drop in volume by half. Her chestnut hair fell loose at her shoulders. Her cream coat hung open over a tailored dress. Her shoes were the kind of shoes that did not creak. 2 members of senior staff walked half a step behind her, one with a slim folder, the other already glancing at the cameras. Patrick saw her first. The color left his face in one smooth motion, the way water leaves a sink. Madison saw her second, and the change in Madison's face was even more striking, because Madison had been practicing her smile for important people for years, and she pulled it on now with a snap. "Messieurs." "Crane," Madison said, stepping forward. "We weren't expecting you tonight. I'm so sorry we have a small situation, but I'm handling it." "A guest is being difficult about." Scarlett Crane held up one finger. It was a small gesture. It silenced Madison instantly. Scarlett's eyes moved over the table. They moved over Andrew, standing tall and still beside his daughter. They moved over Grace, whose chin had lifted bravely. And then they moved to the older woman in the gray wool coat, the one with the wooden buttons and the leather handbag worn smooth at the corners, and something in Scarlett's face did a quiet, unmistakable thing. It did not break. It did not even crack. It simply emptied of everything she had walked in with and refilled with something older and softer and far more frightened. "Madison," Scarlett said, without looking away from Vivian, "tell me again, what was the situation you were handling?" Madison glanced at Patrick. Patrick glanced at the floor. "A walk-in, Miss Crane," Madison said carefully, without a reservation. "We felt her presence was not in keeping with the standards of the dining room. And this gentleman became aggressive when we tried to manage the situation." "Her presence," Scarlett repeated softly, "was not in keeping with the standards of the dining room." "Yes, Miss Crane. And you decided that based on what, exactly?" Madison swallowed. The room was perfectly silent now, Even the pianist had stopped, mid-phrase, his fingers resting above the keys. Her appearance, ma'am. We have to protect the atmosphere our other guests are paying for. Scarlett nodded, very slowly, once. Then she walked past Madison. She walked past Patrick. She walked the last 6 steps to table 9, and she stopped beside the chair where the older woman sat with her hands still resting around a child's water glass. Scarlett knelt down. She did not seem to notice that her cream coat brushed the floor. She took Vivian's free hand between both of hers, and she said, in a voice that carried through the room because she did not try to hide it, "Grandmother. I am so sorry." The dining room understood it then, all at once, the way a room understands a small earthquake. Scarlett rose. She turned to face the rest of the restaurant. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "For those of you who do not know," she said, "the woman you have just spent the last 20 minutes laughing at, ignoring or silently allowing to be insulted, is Vivian Crane. She founded this restaurant 46 years ago with my grandfather, in a 30-seat dining room on the south side of this city. The line you can read on the back of every menu in front of you tonight, the line that says every guest deserves a seat with dignity, was written by her hand in 1979. And tonight, in her own restaurant, she was almost asked to leave because her coat was too old. Nobody moved. Brandon Pierce had gone the precise color of a dinner napkin. Vivian put a gentle hand on her granddaughter's wrist. "Scarlett, dear, please, that is enough." But Scarlett did not stop. She turned now to Andrew, and her sharp, careful face had gone very quiet. "Sir," she said. "May I ask your name?" "Andrew. Andrew Blake. Mr. Blake. Did you know who she was?" "No." "Would it have changed what you did?" Andrew looked at his daughter. Grace looked back at him. He shook his head once. "It shouldn't have to," he said. "And no, it wouldn't have." Scarlett held his eyes for a long second. Then she turned, slowly, to Madison Reed. She did not yell. She did not theatricalize. What she did was almost worse. She spoke to Madison the way a person speaks when they have already made every decision they are going to make, and only the words remain. "Miss Reed," Scarlett said, "I am not going to fire you tonight because you insulted my grandmother. I am going to fire you tonight because you believed you had the right to treat any older woman who walked through that door the way you treated her. The fact that she happens to be the founder of this company is not why you are losing your position. The fact that you would have done the same to a stranger is." Madison's face went white, then red. "Crane, please, if I had known." "That is the problem, Ms. Reed," Scarlett said very gently. "You only know how to respect people once you know they have power over you. That is not a quality this company can afford. Please collect your things. We will mail your final paycheck." She turned next to Patrick. Patrick had been trying to make himself slightly smaller for several minutes, and had nearly succeeded. "Mr. Sloan, you have managed this dining room for 6 years. In that time you have received, by my count from this evening's review, 11 written complaints about discriminatory seating and service. You logged them all as customer error. I am suspending you, effective tonight, pending a full audit by corporate. You will not return to this floor until that audit is complete. If at the end of it I find that you knowingly allowed this culture to grow in my restaurant, you will not return at all." Patrick lowered his head. He did not protest. There was nothing left to protest with. Scarlett let the silence sit. Then she turned back to the dining room, the well-dressed dining room, the dining room that had laughed quietly into its wine glasses, and looked away. "To the rest of you," Scarlett said, "you are welcome to finish your meal. Your bills tonight will be on the house. I would ask only one thing in return. The next time you sit in a restaurant of mine, or of anyone else's, and you see a person being made small in front of you, I would ask that you remember that you had the option, this evening, to be the one who stood up. And that you chose instead to watch." Vivian rose then, carefully, leaning a little on the back of Grace's chair. She did not look angry. She looked tired, and she looked sad, and underneath those two things she looked like a woman who had just been given back something very old and very important. "I do not want anyone in this room to feel ashamed because of who I am," she said. "I want you to feel something else. The next time a woman without a famous name walks through a door, and a young person at a desk decides she does not belong, I want you to speak up. Speak up before you know who she is. Speak up when the only thing protecting her is whether you choose to use your voice. That is what dignity actually costs." She turned to Andrew. She reached, with a hand that trembled only slightly, into the pocket of her gray coat, and she drew out a small, tarnished pin. It was the size of a quarter. On its face was a tiny enameled image of a round table, the symbol Henry and Vivian had used at their very first restaurant. She bent forward with effort, and she pinned it carefully to the collar of Grace's cardigan, just beside the small painted sun. "This belonged to my husband," Vivian said softly. "He gave it to me the night we opened our first dining room. He told me a good table is one where no one is left standing outside. Tonight, sweetheart, you reminded an old woman that her husband was right." Grace stared at the pin, then up at Vivian, then back at her father. "Daddy," she whispered, "did we save her?" Andrew knelt down, and he settled his daughter's hair behind her ear with one careful hand. "No, honey," he said. "She was stronger than we knew. We just made sure she didn't have to stand alone." Scarlett watched them for a long moment. Then she walked over and offered Andrew her hand. He shook it. "Mr. Blake," she said, "I would like, when you have time, to talk with you. Not for a reward. Not for a free meal. For something more useful. This company is going to begin a program we should have begun a long time ago. We are going to call it the Open Table Standard. Every restaurant in this group will retrain its staff in how to treat older guests, working guests, single parents, anyone who walks in without a famous coat. Every location will receive unannounced visits. Every manager who tolerates what was tolerated in this room tonight will be removed. I would like you to advise that program on whatever schedule allows you to put your daughter first. Because you saw what we had stopped seeing. And I think it would do this company good to listen to a man who notices." Andrew did not answer right away. He looked down at Grace, who was watching with her whole small heart. He thought of Hannah. He thought of his mother in the insurance office. He thought of the rain still coming down softly on the street outside. "I will think about it," he said. "I would like to think about it with my daughter." Scarlett nodded, as if that were exactly the answer she had hoped to hear. The rain had thinned by the time Andrew helped Grace into her small coat and led her out under the long awning. The pavement shone like a dark mirror under the streetlights, and the city seemed, for one quiet moment, washed clean. Grace held her father's hand and walked with her chin lifted in a way he had never seen before, the small round pin glinting at her collar. "Daddy?" she said. "Yes, sweetheart. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you were tonight." Andrew stopped walking. He turned and crouched until his eyes were level with hers. He took both her small hands in his. "You already are, honey," he said. "You were brave first." Inside, behind the long window, Scarlett Crane stood beside her grandmother, looking at a small black and white photograph that had hung on the wall for 20 years, and that no one, not even Scarlett, had really looked at in a long time. It showed a young Henry and a young Vivian standing in the doorway of their very first dining room, beneath a hand-painted sign. Vivian rested a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Reputation," the old woman said softly, "you can buy with money. Dignity, my dear. You have to defend every single day, in every single room, even when no one is watching." Scarlett nodded, and her eyes shone and she did not wipe them. Out on the sidewalk, Andrew picked up his daughter and carried her toward the bus stop, because their car was old and the parking near the restaurant was expensive, and that too did not matter. Grace rested her head against his shoulder and watched the lights of the city blur past, and somewhere inside her small chest, She was already learning the lesson that her father had spent his whole life trying to teach her without saying it out loud. You do not need to be rich to be the most important person in a room. You only need to be the one who refuses to look away when someone else has been left alone. You do not have to know a person's name to know that their seat belongs to them. The next time the world gets quiet around a stranger who has done nothing wrong, do not wait. Stand up. Pull out a chair. Say, with your whole heart, the only words that have ever truly changed a room worth changing. Please, sit with us.